In episode 1, we talked about some of the things we did during our helicopter days while waiting for the house to sell. Again. In June, Brother Fred and his new bride Chris were visiting Sister Kathy and her husband Scott in Pennsylvania. They were celebrating their nuptials with a balloon ride over the Lancaster farmland and asked us to join them. Of course we said yes. We left Chambersburg for the hour-and-a-half drive to Lancaster early in the morning. The house sold in August and we were free at last, officially homeless. Almost. We had a wedding to attend in Charlotte in September, so we helicoptered a bit longer. Next stop, Conross Park Campground, just about a 15-minute drive to Clemson University. Conross Park on Hartwell Lake was a nice campground. Plenty of room for our trailer with a nice sand patio area for relaxing. Opal found her spot under the picnic table. And Hartwell is a nice lake for kayaking. Hanover House was built in 1716 by French Huguenot Paul de Saint-Julien, who owned a rice plantation north of Charleston and named it for King George I, who was instrumental in helping the Huguenots come to the British colonies in America to avoid persecution in 1685. The home remained in the family of Saint-Julien and his descendants for 150 years. For rural electrification in the 1930s and 40s, the Cooper River was to be dammed, creating Lake Moultrie, and the historic structure was due to be demolished. Instead, it was moved 250 miles to the Clemson University campus. In the 1950s, the Spartanburg chapter of the National Society of Colonial Dames took charge of furnishing the home in the style of an early 18th century rice plantation, and it has been open as a museum since 1962. It was uprooted again in the 1990s and moved to the 300-acre South Carolina Botanical Gardens on the Clemson grounds.
Summer was over. Autumn found us in a national recreation area we discovered in 2010 during our first RV excursion celebrating our retirement.
Land between the lakes in Kentucky and Tennessee. Prior to the TVA projects of the 1930s, it would have been land between the rivers, the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, which were dammed for rural electrification, creating Kentucky Lake on the Tennessee and Lake Barkley on the Cumberland.
We spent 5 weeks there, finally able to leave the Charlotte area and start our new lives.
Being newbies in the world of full-time RVers, we were feeling our way and made some decisions that didn't quite work out.
One of those was keeping my Subaru. Our intention was to keep the truck for the heavy work of hauling our fifth wheel trailer and to keep the car for all of our running around. We'd travel in separate vehicles and talk over the walkie-talkies.
Dumb idea.
The car became a traveling garage. There was no room for both of us and Opal when out for a scenic drive, so we used the truck.
Our expected short trips when moving from one location to another were generally a few hours. We were spending money on additional fuel, and I missed traveling alongside my wife.
And I missed my hubby.
We decided to get rid of a lot of the junk we were carrying around and sell the car. Luckily, Fred and Chris, being newlyweds and consolidating two households, thought that a compact station wagon could fit into their plans. So they came down from Michigan to visit for a few days and take the car back with them. While with us, we rented a pontoon boat for a day of sightseeing and fishing on Lake Barkley.
Steve, being the techie genius that he is, lost most of his photos from our early days. So this is the only picture of me from that boat ride. When they left, Fred and Chris took the Subaru back home. I'd had many adventures with it and was sorry to see it go.
Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers were important Confederate strongholds in the early days of the Civil War. Rivers at that time were major transportation routes, crucial to both the Union and Rebel armies for moving troops and supplies. The Union's Anaconda Plan intended cutting off all Confederate commerce, including control of supply lines, rivers, and rails, not only in the heart of the Confederate States, but also to the border states, especially Tennessee and Kentucky, which both had divided loyalties. Control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers was critical. An obscure Union brigadier general by the name of Ulysses S. Grant devised a plan of a unified attack on Fort Henry by naval gunboats from one direction and the Army from another. Bad weather delayed Grant's arrival, but didn't hinder Admiral Andrew Foote, and knowing of Grant's approach, Confederate General Lloyd Tillman surrendered on February 6, 1862. Grant's next move was 12 miles east to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, a more difficult target. With the Union Army's approach, Confederate General John Floyd launched an attack, hoping to open an escape route for his troops if Grant succeeded in taking the fort. Grant counterattacked, and though an escape route had been opened, Floyd ordered his troops back to Donelson, an indefensible position with Grant's overwhelming forces approaching from one direction and Admiral Foote's gunboats from the other. Nathan Bedford Forrest was disgusted with political General Floyd's cowardice and pulled his 600 cavalry troops out through the open escape route toward Nashville. That night, Floyd and General Pillow, his second in command, being too important to become prisoners of war, skedaddled, leaving General Simon Buckner, Grant's old friend from Mexican War days, in charge. Buckner calculated that the coming battle would result in 75% casualties and sent a note to Grant asking for terms. Though signed by Buckner, Grant believed Floyd to still be in charge and demanded unconditional surrender. Humiliated by his old friend's demand, Buckner had no choice but to comply. The actual surrender terms were less harsh to the rebel forces than Grant's note indicated they might be. but Northern press, exhilarated by his victory, using his initials US, renamed him Unconditional Surrender Grant. Kentucky was now in Union control, and both the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers were open to Union traffic deep into the heart of the Confederacy. And Ulysses Unconditional Surrender Grant was on his way to immortality.
We continued our time at Land Between the Lakes by indulging in our passion for photography. Everywhere we went, our cameras came with us.
Something that draws the camera to our eyes like a magnet is dead stuff. Dead trees, dead barns, dead houses. Even, perish the thought, dead RVs.
We found an abundance of barn quilts through the area. One photo we couldn't resist was this proud mama showing off her baby.
We got our paddles wet. And took Opal for long walks. We enjoyed the living history at the home place, an 1850s era working farm. And the elk and bison prairie.
A flock of turkeys reminded us it was time to move on to Mississippi and Thanksgiving dinner with family in Corinth.
In Mississippi, it wasn't far to Tuscumbia, Alabama, for the birthplace and home of Helen Keller. The home is furnished with original Keller family possessions. Those that have seen the movie The Miracle Worker starring Patty Duke and Anne Bancroft will recognize the water pump where Anne Sullivan finally broke through the communication barrier and young Helen said the word water. On the way to Tuscumbia, we passed a sign pointing to the Coon Dog Cemetery. Intrigued, we went back the next day. Any pet owner knows that pets aren't animals. They are family, and coon dogs are no exception. These hounds had a very special bond with their owners. Some markers are elaborate, some are simple, all are touching. At the end of the Thanksgiving holiday, as we were preparing to move on, we had a phone call from Fred in Michigan. We dropped everything, left the trailer in Mississippi, and drove north for the funeral of nephew Steve, tragically killed in a motorcycle accident. The Mississippi State Parks were very helpful. We'd used up our 2-week maximum stay at J.P. Coleman Park, but they let us leave the trailer in our sight for the duration of our trip. Our next stop was to be in Natchez, also a state park, and they issued us a voucher for our prepayment, which we applied for our additional stay at Coleman. After an emotional stay with Fred and Chris, we made a stop in Ohio on the long drive back to Mississippi in Wapakoneta, Ohio, home of Neil Armstrong, at the Armstrong Air and Space Museum.